Hello friends, my name is Thursatru, and today I'm going to talk about Thursatru. I'm going to share with you the fundamental notions of this neo-pagan branch based on Northern European Pagan Traditions. I will approach this subject the same way I did when I've made the video about Thursatru. Thursatru denies the concept of religion, so it's more of a spirituality highly philosophical in its approach to the Norse myths and spiritual understanding. Therefore, it doesn't have laws, rules, dogmas and canons that one must follow in order to achieve something greater. If anything, it's actually the opposite. It's embracing the chaotic side of the self to reach deeper knowledge. Because of this, I will speak about Thursatru by also giving you my own notions on this spiritual branch of Norse paganism. Throughout this video, you may find similarities with Thursatru, and if you want to check that video, just click on this upper corner. But it's important to make something clear between these two extensions of Norse paganism. Thursatru doesn't deny the existence of the Donic deities, the underworld and chaotic deities of Norse paganism. It includes all the gods, and none of them are seen as good or bad, but as essential sides of the psychological self. And it's also a spirituality much more primitive in its approach to Norse paganism, much more tribal and shamanic in nature, trying to figure out the raw spiritual understanding of Norse spirituality without Christian influences and even without continental Germanic influences. I would say Thursatru explores the mind of the Paleolithic Norse ancestors, while in Thursatru there is a clear emphasis on the Donic gods and quite obviously on the Thurs, the primordial beings. When you explore Thursatru on the internet or ask people about it, the first notion that people will immediately share is that Thursatru is the satanic version of Norse paganism, which isn't far from the truth. In fact, I agree. Obviously, we are not talking about worshipping the devil, blood sacrifices, eating goats for breakfast and whatnot. Not even Satanism itself is about that. It's about what the figure of the devil represents: freedom from oppressive religious concepts, seeking our own spiritual path without having to follow the spiritual and religious notions of others. Basically, following your own dreams and perspectives without being influenced or living the dreams of others. So in Thursatru, you seek spiritual freedom and deeper knowledge in what the Thurs represent, the primordial beings. Mind that the Thurs, especially the Hrimthursar, frost giants, are not seen as beings of good, and we are not trying to find any good in them. There is no way around that. They were evil in nature, but what they represent is knowledge and the hidden secrets before a divine order was implemented and forced upon the cosmos. They represent the first stages of creation, the raw ancient wisdom of the foundations of the cosmos itself and the first stages of creation. So what's greatly emphasized in Thursatru is what the primordial beings and their descendants represent: spiritual knowledge without the influence of preconceived religious notions that turns us all into mindless sheep. It's to work with the darkest and deepest sides of the self that we so fervently try to hide and deny, but it's necessary to understand the chaos within us because it is as much part of us as it is part of nature, and a balance cannot be achieved if you deny a great part of your own existence. As I've said many times before, great knowledge and the hidden secrets are found in the darkest places. It's not about having a dualistic view of the world, good and evil, light and darkness. It's about order and chaos, and understanding both and make them part of your lives as sources of knowledge. The aim isn't to seek salvation, it's to achieve greater knowledge. As such, Thursatru is a self-directed spiritual journey towards the initiation into the secrets embodied in the Thursar, the primordial beings, and what they represent as forces of nature and the psychological self. Going back to Ginnungagap, the great void before creation, before the divine order of the gods we are so familiar with was imposed upon every entity. The knowledge coming from the shapeless infinity, the primordial dimensional chaos, which is in itself represents a formless conscious eternity that isn't bound to any law. Therefore, it's without restrictions and it continues to evolve in freedom. So, with all of this being said, it probably crossed your mind that Thursatru is much more Gnostic in nature, a Gnostic revival movement of Norse spirituality, more or less. Meaning that there is the notion that matter is evil, therefore evil was the source of creation. Not in a way that it's a conscious entity that makes evil because it wants to see suffering and pain, but it's just evil in nature, and it's that evil force that it's capable of giving shape and create. Therefore, the non-material, the spiritual, is good. Also, and as I've said before, it's not about salvation or having restrictions because it's sinful or forbidden because an imposing order doesn't allow. It's about fighting against ignorance, and for that one must get in touch with secret knowledge to achieve greater wisdom. And to do so, one must find the divine spark that was trapped within us during creation, the God self. First knowing and understanding the gods within ourselves, and only after we are able to understand the gods outside ourselves. Because each of us has great potential to become great and wise if we unlock the secrets within ourselves, if we unlock the divine spark. In a very short sentence, I would say that Thursatru is the exact opposite of sacrificing the beauty of the individual for the sake of the group. Thursatru is an individual spiritual path in search for greater knowledge, because there isn't spiritual evolution and freedom if we are bound to the notions and dreams of one single individual. That is called religion, following the dreams and ideas of others. Spiritual freedom comes by understanding ourselves first, who we truly are. Everyone knows what they want, but few know what they need. But this doesn't mean that we must impose and force others to believe in our spiritual notions and ideas. Thursatru is a lonely spiritual path from start to finish. But mind that you can still be part of pagan groups and share ideas and concepts, share knowledge for the sake of wisdom. But your spiritual path is yours alone. You don't need to follow the footsteps of another person. Others walk their own spiritual path. They leave behind their prints and they make their own way. If you follow an existing path and if you easily follow the footsteps marked on the ground, you are not looking forward, you are looking down at the path because you are concentrating on following it and not learning from the surroundings and from everything that is happening around you along that path. Thursatru is about walking through grounds never before been taken. You are making your own way. So, with all of this being said, let's start this video. You will better understand all these notions with examples I shall give you. Let's start by addressing the Gnosticism notion within Thursatru. Gnosticism was a religion of those who were convinced that a divine ingredient was present within the self. the God self, the divine self. The understanding and use of this ingredient was considered sacred knowledge. So this ingredient was the true gnosis, the true knowledge, which led the individual to become better and to develop a perfect order and harmony within himself or herself. Among Norse and Germanic, we have the figure of Odin, who perfectly embodies this notion of Gnosticism. Odin is the archetype of insatiable quest for knowledge. In the quest for spiritual knowledge, the human being struggles in a fight between two polar opposites, good and evil, light and darkness. But he's not going anywhere unless he accepts order and chaos within all things, especially within him or herself. We suffer because we do not understand our beginning, and therefore what we shall become isn't clear, and we struggle in doubt, and doubt causes pain, fear, and suffering. So understanding the true gnosis, the true knowledge, becomes the entire reason of our existence, why we are here for. To learn, to acquire knowledge, to evolve. The whole purpose of man's evolution is to bring the mind and body to perfect coordination. The problem is, the world itself causes limitations to the physical, which will reflect on the mental level. However, we can still develop our mental level in order to break these limitations. But we, as mortals, create a lot of psychological limitations as well. We create our own religions and then impose them on people. And then we create mental limitations on those people too. No one will achieve true knowledge if we create these religious and spiritual limitations. Making people following one specific line of thought won't give them the understanding that in truth they are free to pursue their own line of thought. So the Gnosticism reflected on Thursatru is the search for the truth and the inner development encountered in the vital experiences of the personal level and the psychic level. When we deal with the Norse myths, we can clearly see the limitations imposed. In practical terms, we cannot move forward because the closest to our time the literary sources get, the more influences from various religious realities they contain. We must move backwards to the oldest literary sources because they contain less religious influences that overlap the real Norse pagan mind. And the older they get, the closest to the pagan mind they are. Spiritually speaking, it's the exact same thing. When Odin comes, and then later the Aesir, they imposed their order upon all living things. They even imposed their own order and limitations to creation itself. Odin, Gunnar, and Lodor gave existence to mankind, and in that moment they inserted in us the divine spark, which we will be able to reach through great effort in order to achieve greater knowledge and become better beings. But Odin, Gunnar, and Lodor are not the ones responsible for creation itself. That would be the ones before the gods themselves, the very ancestors of the gods. So we must move backwards in this as well, to Ginnungagap, the Great Void. Ginnungagap represents a formless eternity free from any law or order imposed by any entity, because Ginnungagap itself is a conscious reality capable of creating. Because it's free from limitations, it creates in freedom and gives form. It's limitless in its own creations and continues to evolve. And from it comes the first beings, the þursatrú, the primordial beings. The primordial beings were evil in nature. Creation itself was born out of evil. This is what I meant when I said that matter was evil in a Gnostic sense, that creation comes from evil. So, there you have. Ginnungagap represents the self without boundaries, without an order creating limitations. And so in freedom we are able to constantly evolve, while Odin and the Aesir represent the limitations imposed upon us, but also the divine spark within us, which we shall be able to reach if we are willing to fight against both the physical and the psychological limitations. In other words, we hold great power within ourselves, and if we were able to reach it so easily, we would unleash great evil upon everything, great destruction and chaos. So the secret knowledge is safely locked within ourselves, and we have great potential to become better if we unlock the hidden secrets. Progressively learning and evolving, we are able to control this divine spark, because in our pursuit for wisdom, we understand its value and how powerful it is. Without the limitations, we would be beings of chaos and destruction, because that would be our nature. We wouldn't be able to go against it or prevent it because we wouldn't know how. That's why the primordial beings are or were evil, because that was their own nature without limitations. Their power was in its raw state, so they simply existed, and by existing they unleashed their own essence, which was evil and chaotic in nature. They were not evil because they had the notion of good and evil. They were evil because they just were, because there were no limitations for their existence. So in other words, when dealing with Norse spirituality, we must not stick to the Aesir and Vanir only. We must also take into consideration the Thursatru, the primordial beings, because they are the representation of power in its raw state. They are the representation of secret knowledge. They are the chaotic side of nature and all things. And we, as mortal beings, shouldn't try to so fervently deny or hide the chaos within us. We should learn how to work with it as well. By understanding the chaos in us, we understand the divine spark, and we are able to break the limitations in order to reach that divine spark, that sacred knowledge. The Thursatru were evil in nature, but they are just as important as the Aesir and all the other gods, because they hold the ancient knowledge, the knowledge of the origins and the beginning of all things. And this is perfectly expressed in the Norse myths themselves. The Aesir are always in conflict with the giants, with the Jotnar, the descendants of the Thursatru. Not because of racial differences or because of the same old idea of good versus evil. The Aesir, the Vanir, the giants, underworld gods, and every entity in the Norse myths cannot be contained within the simple notion that ones are good and others are evil. Every god and every other creature is both good and evil. The reason why the Aesir are always in war with the giants is because of knowledge. The Jotnar are the direct descendants of the Thursatru. Therefore, they hold the ancient knowledge, the ancient secrets, and the Aesir want those secrets, want that knowledge. This is why we have plenty of myths of Odin doing all sorts of things to get their knowledge. Odin murders, rapes, destroys, lies. He does great evil to get his hands on the hidden secrets. He goes to dark places. He sacrifices parts of himself and his own life to get knowledge. He does both good and evil to achieve greater wisdom. Just take a look at how Odin stole the mead of poetry. Odin killed Baugi's servants just to take their place and get closer to Baugi. He deceived Baugi, blackmailed him, tricked him, lied to him, and murdered him when he had no further need of the giant. Then he tricks Sutung and his own daughter and sleeps with her, and then steals from them and takes the mead of poetry. In this account, Odin is named Bolverkre, worker of misfortune. In this account, Odin was a liar, a trickster, a murderer, just to take the meat of poetry. And why? Because the meat of poetry was a source of great wisdom coming from the giants, a source of hidden knowledge. What I'm trying to say here is that Odin, nowadays, is seen as a benevolent figure when the Norse myths clearly demonstrate that he was not. Odin takes the pursuit for greater knowledge to extremes. He sacrifices an eye in the well of Mimir, a giant. He did all that he did to get the meat of poetry made out of the blood of Kvasir, a giant. Odin sacrificed himself for the secret of the runes, and where do you think he got those secrets from? I would say from Ginnungagap itself, because Odin kills himself to reach another state of existence, another reality beyond the limitations of the world, into a place without limitations, which is Ginnungagap. The Norse myths aren't fairy tales of impossible things just to amuse the young ones or to make modern people laugh at the delusions of our ancestors. The Norse myths are hidden knowledge, safely guarded in metaphors. The knowledge is out there, but it can't be given so freely, because we must work for it in order to understand it. If it is given to us, we will never give a proper value to it. But if we work hard for it, we come to understand it and the great consequences and responsibilities that great knowledge brings into our lives and our own existence. Thursatru tries to reflect this, the relentless pursuit for knowledge, which will give deep understanding of things, and therefore it helps us to evolve and to become greater beings. But at the same time, there are devastating consequences and sacrifices must be made. There is great pain and suffering, but also great reward. Spiritual knowledge isn't a linear path safely walking straight ahead until the end. On the contrary, spiritual knowledge is a maddening, chaotic journey, up and down, forward and backwards, going in circles, because many times we must experience the same things, and in the face of the same circumstances, we must take different actions, because the final result is always different. And that's how you obtain knowledge, by of all things, by trying and failing until you succeed. And it isn't pleasant, but it gives great rewards that in the long run will worth all the trouble. Thursatru basically means the belief in the Thursar, and therefore also in their descendants, who still hold the ancient power and knowledge of the primordial beings. It's to understand the essence and darker aspects in Old Norse traditions, because darker paths and magical practices are also sources of knowledge as good as any to be in touch with the divine, by understanding the chaos, darkness and more negative aspects of ourselves, instead of denying that which makes us humans and imperfect beings. But certain aspects of the human psychological condition only seems imperfect and negative because we make a division between what seems to be good and what seems to be bad. But if we understand imperfection as something essential that needs to exist to be combined with other aspects, we come to realize that there is a balance that makes us who we are, complex beings with no limitations in the pursuit for knowledge and power. Chaos alone is bad, and so is order, but both combined create something better, something greater and unique. So you cannot deny the chaos in you, because combined with more orderly aspects of yourself will turn you into an entity capable of achieving everything. Nothing is impossible to achieve if you create a balance within yourself. This is why in Thursatru the foundations of this spirituality lie not only in the primordial powers before creation and divine order, but also in the underworld. Old Norse spirituality and religion also came with a great devotion to underworld deities and black magical practices related to such deities, which, unfortunately, with the passage of time and other religious influences, the underworld and chaotic powers were progressively put aside, and a great fear was built upon it, and Old Norse traditions lost balance. You see, the great majority of pagans nowadays seek a spiritual quest that is associated with heavenly realities, and will spend most of their religious practices striving to achieve light through a more pleasant path, which is a complete illusion. This reflects the great influence from religions such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In those religions, the divine world exists somewhere in an unreachable place out of our mortal reality, where the sky god of light is a masculine tyrant, which brings false light and false ideas of salvation. That light associated with that god is something that enslaves souls and imprisons them so that they become nothing more than servants of that deity, incapable of evolving and actually reaching the true light, because they are bound to the light of that deity, to the ideas, laws, rules, imposed order of that deity. You are either with that god or you are against him, no middle ground, which creates clear limitations in the freedom of your very existence. In the older pagan traditions, the divine could also be found here on earth, and most importantly, inside it, in the underworld, literally the earth beneath our feet. The gods were not just male, but also female, and in many cases more common than we believe, both genders at once. Our ancestors didn't seek light only. Darkness was also an important aspect of nature to be accepted and aid in the spiritual quest. The underworld was as important to visit as the heavenly places, and this is very much reflected on Old Norse traditions. In the Nordic tradition, darkness is indispensable to achieve illumination. As I've said before, Odin, to acquire the knowledge of the runes, hanged himself in the world tree, to die and go into the depths to find the runes. The secrets and mysteries of the runes were hidden in the underworld. Knowledge protected by the descendants of the primordial beings. Odin's sacrifice in the world tree is not an attempt to save humankind from their sins. Odin didn't sacrifice himself to save us. Odin stabs himself, hangs himself, and dies by his own free will. The Old Norse traditions don't have the concept of an original sin from which mankind and the world we live in must be saved. Odin hangs himself to gain wisdom and power. Odin sacrificed himself in his quest for the utmost secrets of the cosmos. It's clear that in Thursatru, the spirituality is much more focused on the underworld gods, but Odin himself is not forgotten. He just isn't seen as a messiah or a benevolent god, a figure new pagans try to compare with the Christian, Jewish, Islamic ideals, because people are seeking a new figure of salvation to replace their old one. Odin in many ways is a dark and demonic god who was greatly feared, respected and honored by our Norse ancestors. He was a role model, the archetype of searching for knowledge and power by unlocking the hidden secrets contained in the darkest, ancient and dangerous places. Odin also represented the magical initiation of knowledge and power. Odin didn't want to save us with his sacrifice. He wanted to teach us with his sacrifice that we can save ourselves from weaknesses and uncertainty. So I thought you should understand that within Thursatru, Odin isn't forgotten. The aim is to break the image people have of him as a benevolent god, all-powerful, all-beneficial, a savior and bringer of light. That's something people coming into neo-pagan reconstructions of Northern European pagan traditions should definitely take into consideration if the objective is to let go the previous oppressive religions people are trying to get away from. Coming into a pagan path is to change the worldview. It's to embrace and accept this world as it is, with all its imperfections and perfections, with all its chaos and order. I would like to talk a bit about the importance of the origins of the universe as seen in the Norse myths and how that reflects the spiritual perspectives in Thursatru. In the beginning, there was nothing, a great void of emptiness and endless darkness, a void where neither physical laws of either space or time existed. Power floated without limitations in this existence. An existence that in itself is a paradox, where everything and nothing lived. But because of its freedom, everything was able to become and evolve. This was Ginnungagap. In this great void, Muspelheim was created, the realm of fire. Then came Niflheim, the realm of ice. Both fire and ice collided, and these chaotic primordial powers spread in Ginnungagap to create the first vestiges of life. Ice melted and formed the first cosmic river, a source of water named Elivagar, which stretched across the great void. The source of this river is the spring named Hvergelmir. The two primordial elements began to meet within Ginnungagap, the birth of creation. Life began to flourish when fire and ice together gifted the physical universe with cosmic essence, which gave life. New existence began to come forth from the darkness, out of the harmonious nothingness and from the drops of the icy rivers of Elivagar, which began to drip and fuse with the fire and heat from Muspelheim. The very essence of this cosmic ice was unleashed, and with the warmth of fire it formed matter, which formed the first being. The right conditions created the very first life form, the very first Thurs, Horgelmir, also known as Ymir. Horgelmir was the purest essence of fire and ice combined with the essence of darkness itself from Ginnungagap. This was the first primordial being that gave life to the rest, the ancestor of the giants and subsequently the gods. Horgelmir was evil, simply evil, and all his offspring likewise. They were the purest form of existence, the very first creation, the combination of powerful elements, chaotic in nature. And so to the very core, these beings were evil because there was nothing more to their existence. So this understanding of creation in Norse mythology is taken into Thursatru. The purpose is to become one with the raw essence before creation and to become as pure as its beginning. To achieve the primordial knowledge, the very first knowledge, to be able to understand the rest, the entire journey all the way into the future. We are organisms made from proto-cosmic matter and cosmic matter. Within ourselves, there is both the essence of creation, which is our physical self, and there is the divine spark deep inside our spiritual self. The physical and the spiritual are one and the same, and we must find the perfect balance between the two to ignite the divine spark and light the fire which will give us illumination. This illumination is achieved through acquiring sacred knowledge, primordial wisdom, which is why there is a great emphasis on the Thursar within Thursatru, because they were the first forms of creation, from which all wisdom is derived. Chaos is an essential aspect within Thursatru, because it's from chaos that all life begins, and the primordial beings are chaos itself. So without a doubt, in Thursatru, there is also a great emphasis on the descendants of the Thursar, which are Loki, Angrboda, their children, and also there is a very huge emphasis on Gulveig, which in Thursatru gains a whole other meaning and becomes much more complex than what the literary sources provide. Someday I would like to speak about Gulveig, including both what we know from the sources and also her role in everything as it is perceived in Thursatru. But for now, suffice to say that these beings are the personification of the chaotic side in humans, the complexity of the self and the struggle within ourselves to contain the chaotic, destructive side in all of us, which is power that we are withholding, that could be used for great purposes, including to achieve sacred knowledge. This is how the gods are perceived, as personifications of various parts of the self. The god's essence combined forms the individual and all its complex physical, mental and spiritual existence. You work with a handful of gods. You are only working with parts of yourself and leaving the other parts aside. Therefore, you will never feel whole, and half of your potential is asleep and a great part of yourself is not being used. When you work with all the gods and understand each part they play within yourself, you wake up powers that you didn't even know you had. You wake up primordial powers that will lead you to achieve greater wisdom. There is this tendency to think that the Old Norse religion is built on the notion that both the gods and the giants had a good, profitable relationship. People are trying to find both good and evil, good in the giants and evil in the gods, and vice versa. That somehow the gods and the giants reached a point that they all live in harmony and there is mutual help. Or worse, there is the inclination to believe in a dualistic view of the Old Norse religion, of a fight between good and evil, and that the gods are clearly the good side and the giants the evil side. But I'm not going to delve into that, because within Thursatru, some clearly believe in the dualistic view, and others prefer to stay on the notion of order and chaos as polar opposites that together complement themselves and are necessary for the continuation of the cycle of existence. This is exactly when Thursatru is dangerously jumping from spirituality into religion, because it's inevitable when you share certain philosophies and people start to argue about the truth. But in my honest opinion, no one knows the truth. What we can do is achieving greater knowledge through various techniques. Each one of us can and should have an individual spiritual path, aside from what we already share with groups of people who are more or less into the same religious perspectives that we do. Still, as I've said before, Thursatru is a spirituality highly individualistic. It's for the development of the self. So there is a great emphasis on the individual and his own power. The human being is almost the center of this spirituality, as the vessel through which great knowledge can be acquired. Therefore, in Thursatru, there is also a great focus on what people would call nowadays black magic. I'll be honest with you, again. To me, there is no such thing as black and or white magic. There is only power. Call it magic, if you will, magical essence that we harness through sorcery, and then we give it a purpose. This essence itself isn't black or white, good or evil. It just is. But we are the ones to give it a purpose when we use it. We are the ones to turn it into black magic. So I prefer to say that in Thursatru there is a great focus on magical arts of all sorts, most of which what we like to label black magic. This is why that, in my opinion, I don't think Thursatru is the spiritual path people should be taking the moment they jump into Norse paganism, not even those who are familiar with lots of concepts. In other words, if you have just come into Norse paganism, a type of paganism which focuses on the development of the group and mutual help, building the community, don't jump into something which is solely for the individual. In practical terms, of course, because obviously you can adopt certain philosophies within Thursatru to help you out in your spiritual path. But Thursatru and other such spiritualities, gnostic in nature, are for those with a certain background that gives them enough confidence to work alone and to venture beyond limitations. A constant challenge of the individual, a challenge that we impose ourselves and we cannot get out of it, or the entire purpose of working alone and developing the spiritual self is lost. If you are going to pursue a darker path in life, do it with the absolute certainty that you are mature enough to do it, because there are consequences, because it's hard, because it's destructive, and sacrifices must be made, and you have to be prepared to leave behind along the way important pieces of yourself. The darker paths, practices, and traditions of Norse spirituality and the magical work involved have the objective to strengthen the individual. But to gain such strength, weakness must be left aside. And along the process, there will be a lot of weaknesses of the mind and of the body. But one must overcome such weaknesses. Put your ego behind and think this through before jumping into a path that, instead of helping you evolving, it backlashes and sends you into a position even worse than before. I'm saying this because I know there are a lot of young people who come into paganism because they feel it's cool and out of the ordinary and want to be different. Maybe that's a good reason, enough to get them interested, and then they genuinely develop their spiritual path. But do not jump into something darker, heavier, just because it sounds cool. Arrogance many times is ignorance in disguise, and then it leads to potential destruction. It isn't wise to take a certain path because it sounds cool. It always results in sacrifices that we may not be prepared to make. Don't feel ashamed if you don't feel ready. Each one of us has our own time to act. No one is born with great wisdom. It's a slow process of learning, and better be slow and progressively achieve something than jumping headfirst without measuring the consequences. Thursatru is indeed a darker, lonely spiritual path, which I won't obviously talk about in here, the types of spiritual works and everything involved and magical practices, etc. You need the practical as much as you need the theoretical. But Thursatru isn't meant to be dark or evil. The objective is to progressively proceed with caution and respect and wisdom towards the divine light, not into darkness and destruction. Thursatru is to understand the darkness and chaos and destruction so we might find light in it, because you don't need light in places where light already exists. You need light in places that are too dark and grim for anything to grow. But aside from all of that, one thing to me is certain. All other neo-pagan and pagan reconstructions of Old Norse paganism should definitely adopt the main view of Thursatru. Northern European pagan traditions should move on evolve and expand, not stagnate. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video, and let me make this clear again. Thursatru is not my spiritual path, although in this video I have expressed a lot of my own understandings of this spiritual path. If I have to give a sort of label to my own spiritual path, I would say it's definitely something between Rokathru and Thursatru. In and out, up and down, forward and backwards. I do not follow any other spiritual path but my own. Once again, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video, and as always, primordial.